This is Dr. Michael Cameron, and we are on Registered Behavior Technician modules 19, 20, and 21. One of the things that I want to point out is that I have clustered some of these modules together because they logically link with one another in terms of topical areas. So it's thematic in terms of the presentation and the clustering. So essentially what I'm trying to do for you as a registered behavior technician is to build your repertoire of skills, knowledge, and abilities, and build essentially a toolbox for you that you're using. In the last module, we discussed antecedent control procedures and antecedent interventions, specifically managing discriminative stimuli and managing motivating operations as well. All of those things fall into the category of antecedent interventions. And if you remember from your behavior intervention plan, there's a category in terms of the documentation on that plan where you're listing out your antecedent interventions. And that's exactly where you will be doing that on the behavior support plan. We are moving now into a different category on the behavior intervention plan or behavior support plan. And we're moving into the category of consequence interventions. Consequence control is what we're interested in at this juncture. So that's a little bit of a preview in terms of what we'll be discussing. So specifically, the strands that this comes from in terms of the Registered Behavior Technician task list include D04, D05, and D06, falling squarely in the category of behavior reduction. The specific titles for the strands, first, to implement differential reinforcement procedures. That comes from D04 on the task list. Implement extinction procedures, which is D05 on the task list, and then implement crisis and emergency procedures according to protocol, and that's D06. I just want to point out to you as well that you've achieved a milestone here in terms of this module, because at this point you have completed sections A, B, D, and F. 66% of your training and your instruction is now complete, and I hope that you're getting a really good sense of the accumulation of your own knowledge and information, and that you have some clarity in terms of how the entire behavior analytic process works, moving from establishing rapport with the stakeholders and being part of a team, a diverse team, and then going about this process of assessment and doing skills assessment and doing the FBA, and you participating in that entire process. And then as a result of the completion of skills assessments and an FBA, for example, or a functional analysis, you begin building your plans. What plans? Well, skill acquisition programs you will build. You will build behavior intervention plans as well. So what we'll be discussing today, as we did in the previous module, are things that will be done, interventions that will be used as part of a behavior intervention plan. Once again, why do we want to target behavior and behavior reduction and the deceleration of maladaptive behavior and the acceleration of appropriate behavior? We want to do that because we want to remove the obstacles from an individual's life. And you know as well as I do that various forms of problem behavior, whether it be aggression or inappropriate verbal behavior or property destruction or elopement or noncompliance, all those things are obstacles to an individual's advancement and an obstacle to their inclusion and an obstacle in terms of the opportunities that may be available to them. If we truly are going to normalize an individual's life, give them all the opportunities that people without disabilities have in terms of education and recreation and vocational activity, then we've got to make sure that they're presenting themselves in a socially appropriate manner. So that's why we have these interventions in place. We're trying to build social competence. We're trying to build behavioral regulation and behavioral stability so that there's no obstacles in the person's way. So this is a very important part of our work, is to build these behavior intervention plans. And many of the tools that I'll be discussing today are considerations for you. And I underscore that word consideration because one of the things that is important to know is that every individual you work with is different, and that every individual you work with will have their own intervention that is based on valuable information about them. So you have to have depth as a registered behavior technician in terms of what your options are. What are the options from an antecedent control standpoint? What are the options from a consequence control standpoint? Because in having a rich array of options, you're able to select which of the procedures and the methodologies are most appropriately going to fit the individual that you're working with. So it's my job as your instructor to make sure that you're building your repertoire, that you know what your considerations are, you know what your possibilities are, and then it's up to you and your board certified behavior analyst supervisor to make a determination as to which of those options is most appropriate for the individual that you'll be working with. With respect to the specifics of the module, duration's 90 minutes. At the end of the module, there'll be a competency-based quiz, 5 questions. I like to keep it at 5 questions, and I always give you a preview of questions at the end of the modules. With respect to demonstration recommendations, I suggest this. At the conclusion of this training, ask your BCBA supervisor to describe some of the differential reinforcement procedures he or she uses. There's a number of differential reinforcement methods that can be used, and it'd be a great opportunity for you to have a discussion with your BCBA supervisor in terms of which of those procedures they use commonly in their own clinical practice, and to give you some case study examples of how they've been applied. Especially if the individual has case study examples of how they've been applied with individuals that you'll be working with, that's even a better situation. So ask your BCBA supervisor about that, and then review behavior intervention plans that have been developed by your BCBA supervisor, especially those plans that integrate differential reinforcement and extinction procedures, as well as those behavior intervention plans that integrate a crisis plan, or what I like to refer to as a safety net plan. So once again, I want to remind you about the anatomy of the behavior intervention plan, because we covered this in a previous module. So your expectation as a registered behavior technician should be that what you receive from a board certified behavior analyst should be a documented behavior intervention plan with all those components we've talked about. You know, you got the good definition of the target behaviors. You got a good operational definition. You have clarity in terms of what you're working on. Your data collection method has been spelled out for you. You may be using continuous methods of recording or discontinuous methods of recording or permanent product recording. And then in the actual behavior intervention plan, you should have an outlined strategy for setting events, an outlined strategy for antecedent control, an outlined strategy for consequence control, an outlined strategy for responding to a crisis situation, for example. So those are all the components of a good intervention plan. And your expectation as a registered behavior technician is that you'll have those components available to you. You'll have the documentation available to you as well, so that when you go in to work and to support an individual, you have clarity with respect to what you're supposed to do. So the BCBA supervisor has an obligation to be technological. It's one of the 7 dimensions of behavior analysis, and that is being technological, meaning that they have to describe in very clear terms what the expectations are with respect to the implementation of various procedures. And it should be the case that a person can pick up the document, read a description of the intervention, receive training from the BCBA, even receive role-playing instruction, for example, or there should be some conversation around the plan. But subsequent to that, you should be able to implement it with good procedural integrity and good procedural reliability. So I'm trying to build your expectations and to make it clear to you in terms of what you are responsible for, and what your expectations should be with respect to behavior intervention plans. Finally, I recommend that you demonstrate your ability to implement all the procedures that we're describing with good procedural reliability. And just a reminder, once again, what does that mean? Well, that means that after you've reviewed a plan and you are in the position to actually implement the plan with the individual that you're supporting, your BCBA supervisor will evaluate your implementation and score you on all the components of the plan and give you feedback in terms of whether you maintained integrity in terms of the implementation of the plan as it was mapped out and as it was designed to be implemented. So it's referred to as procedural reliability. Just by way of a quick example, it'd be like somebody giving us a recipe, for example, and let's say they've given us a recipe for sourdough bread, making sourdough bread, and then they stand beside us and watch to make sure that every step of the recipe was followed exactly the way they had mapped it out for you, and they're standing there scoring you to make sure that you used the right amount of flour, the right amount of dough. You grease the pan in a very specific way, and they're scoring you in terms of your capability of following through with each of those component responsibilities. So that's what procedural reliability is. The person, the BCBA, is just making sure that from a procedural standpoint, you're doing everything as it was designed to be done. And it's something that your BCBA supervisor will do in the context of your supervision. So those are my recommendations. Ask your supervisor about the differential reinforcement procedures they've used. Review the intervention plans that have been designed by that BCBA, and especially looking at those that have integrated differential reinforcement and extinction and crisis plans. And then demonstrate your own ability to implement these plans. The specific goals for this module are to first define differential reinforcement for you, as well as discrimination. And then to review an entire host of differential reinforcement procedures. And we've got a lot to talk about. There's differential reinforcement of other behavior. It's also referred to as DRO. And then there's momentary differential reinforcement of other behavior, also referred to as MDRO. Then we have differential reinforcement of alternative behavior, called DRA, and then differential reinforcement of incompatible behavior, it's called DRI, and then differential reinforcement of low rate behavior, DRL, and then differential reinforcement of high rate behavior, DRH. So you're going to come to know these acronyms, and you're going to come to use these acronyms yourself, and you're going to see these forms of interventions, these consequence control interventions, integrated in plans. So I just want to make sure that you got good familiarity with each of these methods and each of these differential reinforcement procedures, so that when it comes time for you to actually review the procedure and to use them yourself, you know exactly how they should be done. My third goal in this module is to define extinction and the functional variations of extinction. Then to discuss how to use the extinction procedures, and then finally to discuss emergency and safety net plans. And throughout this entire module, we'll also discuss your ethical requirements and your ethical responsibilities. Now, similar to what I've done with other modules, I'm going to keep this connected and anchored by case studies. I have a firm belief that when a person learns the best, when a registered behavior technician, in your case, an RBT candidate, if you're learning well, then you're able to connect procedural descriptions to actual stories. So that's why it's always important for me to tell you a story, to give you a case study example, just so you can put this in context and you can see how everything comes together from a behavior analytics standpoint, and you've got stories to connect it to. I think people learn best as a result of connecting it to that kind of information. Incidentally, much of what I do here is based on the Research and Pedagogy by John Bransford. And he used a method that's referred to as anchored instruction, which means he's constantly anchoring an individual and connecting the individual and the concept that they're learning to stories, to case studies, to really authentic examples with a factual base in terms of information and data. So it's a fascinating form of pedagogy and instruction, and I'm using that here in the context of our training. So we've got our goals at this point. So I just want to do a little reality check with you first before going into a lot of the different procedures that we'll be describing. Since we'll be talking about differential reinforcement procedures, I want you to remember that you must identify what an individual's preferences are before you begin designing such a procedure, because we've got to know specifically what their preferences are, what functions as a reinforcer for an individual, because otherwise the plan we design that we intend to function as a form of reinforcement will not have its desired effect unless what we've identified as consequences really do function as reinforcers. So I want you to recruit your knowledge. We talked about preference assessment in the past. We've talked about reinforcement assessment. I want you to recruit that knowledge and bring it into the thinking here, bringing it into the module that we're currently talking about. And remember that reinforcement can be diverse. You've got social reinforcers, activity reinforcers, and tangible reinforcers. Remember the mnemonic device I had mentioned to you, that I taught you, gut, TV, visual. There are gustatory reinforcers you can use, and olfactory reinforcers, and tangible reinforcers, and tactile reinforcers, and vestibular reinforcers, and then visual reinforcers as well. So there's got to be diversity with respect to what you use as reinforcement. And remember as well that that it's a dynamic process. You're constantly re-examining and re-evaluating the reinforcers and what is motivating an individual. This is not something that's done once and you don't do again. It's something that you'll do on a dynamic basis. The other thing I want to remind you of is that there's got to be a goodness of fit between your plan, the person, and the environment. Remember as well that we have ethical considerations in terms of culture. We're always honoring various religious groups and ethnicities and family preferences and honoring their orientation to life in general. So what we select as a reinforcer has got to be a good fit between the person and what you're using for a reinforcer. So there may be restrictions or prohibitions in terms of foods that you use. I just want to make sure that I'm constantly raising your level of awareness and raising your level of sensitivity in terms of what you're doing and what you're using as a reinforcer. And I'm just going to remind you, just ask. Have open conversations with family members, have open conversations with the teachers that you may be working with in a public school, open conversations with other professionals like speech and language pathologists or occupational therapists or physical therapists. Just make sure that there's a goodness of fit between your plan and the culture in which that plan will be implemented. That's a very important responsibility that we have. And remember as well that plans are always individualized. We do not use generic plans. We just do not carry over something that may have worked for some other person, for example, and then it gets carried over to a new individual. Every plan is crafted. Every plan is customized. Every plan is designed based on the good information that we have and the good understanding that we have about the person sitting in front of us. What their strengths are, what their reinforcers are, what the context is in terms of the culture and how we'll be working with the individual. Every plan is individualized and has to be designed with a great level of care and consideration. So I want you to recall that as well. Now, The second point, nothing is static. I've said it already. What functions as a reinforcer is ever changing. We're constantly moving through various motivational states. We're under conditions of satiation and deprivation all the time. Those kinds of things bounce around, they move around. What we find as things that are preferable is constantly changing. It changes in our lives all the time. What you find that functions as a reinforcer on one day or within 1 week or during 1 month may be completely different as time moves on. So we know that about the individuals that we're serving too. So the solution is to constantly do new preference assessments and reinforcer assessments, and to touch base and verify what is functioning as a potential reinforcer, an actual reinforcer, and we're doing that dynamically. The next thing I want to point out about the interventions that we'll be describing, that I'll be describing and talking about today, is that we're always making things achievable. So like everything else we do, the schedule of reinforcement that we select and how we plan on delivering reinforcement must be based on data that we've collected about the individual. So we're making data-based decisions. So the length of time that we use to schedule reinforcers for an individual has to be such that the likelihood of achieving the goal and successfully meeting a goal is high, that there's high probability as a result of a good outcome. And I'll talk more in detail about how to make database decisions about the differential reinforcement procedures that we're using as we move through the description of each of them. The other thing I want to remind you of, or to give you an orientation to, is that for the individual that we're working with, you're constantly stating the contingency. You are communicating to them what the structure is or what the rules are for the plan that you're putting in place. And the individuals that you'll be working with will have a great variety of clinical presentations. I've mentioned this once before, that many individuals are nonverbal. Other individuals are very fluent in terms of their verbal skills. They may even be gifted. They may be falling in the gifted category. So we have an obligation, an ethical obligation, to make sure that we're explaining plans in the most appropriate way based on the person's developmental level, their age, and what their receptive skills are, and what their capacity is for understanding. So for that reason, we are describing the plans that we'll be using to individuals using a variety of different formats. So for many people, it may be something as simple as a first then statement. First you're eating your lunch, and then after lunch you're playing. And you may use that some form of communication that's pictorial based. So you may be communicating by way of picture, for example. Other individuals you're describing plans to verbally because their language skills are as good as yours and as good as mine. And that's your responsibility, is to assess how to best communicate with the individual and to use the form of communication that is best going to result in the individual's understanding of what the plan is that you've put in place. So that's an obligation that we have, is to keep people informed. And the most important person to keep informed is the person that's the recipient of services. The next thing I want to give you an orientation to in terms of these reinforcement systems, you have an obligation as well to be on time and to be consistent with the implementation of the plan. If you break in your own consistency, then that's when you lose or never gain any kind of behavioral control or stimulus control over an individual's behavior. So you have an ethical obligation and a responsibility to follow through with the plan, to be on time with the delivery of your reinforcers, to execute and to implement exactly based on the way the BCBA supervisor has outlined things. Another recommendation I have, and you've heard me talk about this before, I like to emphasize the aesthetic arrangements, and those arrangements being considered so you can maintain the dignity of the clients that you're working with. One of the people that I've mentioned to you before is Dr. Phil Heinlein, and he talked a lot about aesthetic arrangements, and I have a great appreciation for that conversation and that kind of communication. And I'm just going to tell you a quick story here. To give you an example of aesthetic arrangements. It has to do with a group of high school students. There were 12 individuals in a classroom, and it was a private school, so it was a small class size. And the teacher in the classroom wanted to use one of the differential reinforcement procedures that we'll be talking about today, actually. And specifically, it's the differential reinforcement of other behavior, also referred to as DRO. Now, the teacher wanted to ensure that during an interval of time, during a 15-minute period, that this group of students did not have behaviors that took the form of getting out of their seat without permission, or talking out without permission, or having verbal altercations, for example, with other peers in the room. So those were the targets generally. It had to do with their particular behavior. So she set an interval of 15 minutes, and in a little while I'll talk about how that interval for 15 minutes was determined. But she set the interval for 15 minutes. At the end of 15 minutes, if an individual, and she did it person by person, if they refrained from getting out of their seat, so there was an omission of that behavior. If they refrained from talking out, omission of that behavior, or if they refrained from verbal altercations, an omission of that behavior, then they were eligible for reinforcement. And this class was a science class. And one of the things that this teacher was working on was the anatomy of the body, the skeletal structure of the body. So as a reinforcer, what this individual did was the teacher had each of the students cut out of construction paper all of the bones in the human body. So they had construction paper representations of each bone from the human body. So envision this: each student in that classroom has a box in their desk, and one of the things that they've got in that box is each of the bones from the human body. So at the end of a 15-minute period, for example, the teacher would identify the student that passed the DRO contract. Why? Well, because they refrained from talking out, refrained from verbal altercations, and refrained from getting out of their seat. So for each student that passed that contract, she would say to them, reach in your box and pull out the clavicle. And then the student would go to the box, pull out the appropriate bone that was named, and then go to the blackboard in the classroom where their own personal skeleton was being constructed, and they'd put the clavicle in the right location. So the construction paper bones essentially served as a conditioned reinforcer for these individuals. And what happened was that once that person completed a part of the body, for example, with the bones, as a result of passing consecutive DRO contracts, they'd be eligible for a backup reinforcer. They could exchange that completion of the skeletal system for access to something that they were highly interested in, like time to have free to work on the computer or their iPad, for example, or to listen to music on their headphones. So this is a great example of an aesthetic arrangement. If you walked into that science class and looked at what that teacher was doing, you would not find anything contrived. You would know that that teacher was working on the skeletal system. It was a science class, so of course you're going to see the skeleton on a blackboard. And it seems quite normal that you would see something like that. But what you wouldn't see necessarily is that the contract was, the DRO contract was being implemented consistently, that the bones were being used as conditioned reinforcers, that there was an educational opportunity at every pass of the contract, because as a result of the teacher naming the bone, the clavicle, for example, the student would have to make a discrimination among all the bones in their box and pick out the correct one, the clavicle. So it's kind of a match to sample, an auditory visual match to sample exercise. And then that student took that clavicle bone, went up to their personal skeleton on the blackboard, put it in the appropriate place. So there's another educational opportunity as well, the student knowing where that bone belongs in the body. So what a great example. It's a great arrangement where the teacher was using a structure referred to as differential reinforcement of other behavior. She was using the skeletal system and the specific bones in the body as conditioned reinforcers. The student had educational opportunities every single time they passed the DRO contract. They were constructing the skeleton. It looked very normal. It was richly educational, and all things come together at that point in terms of this beautiful interface between behavior analysis, behavioral education, the teacher's responsibility to maintain dignity of each individual, and to keep things stimulating and educational every step of the way. So it's a great example of how this can come together. I'm telling you that story because I want every one of you in this room, each of you going through this training to become a registered behavior technician, I want you to think creatively and out of the box all the time in terms of how you can make these systems that I'm describing to you aesthetically pleasing and aesthetically appropriate, and to maintain dignity of the people that you're working with. And that requires creativity. It requires knowledge of the person that's sitting in front of you and who you're designing the system for. It requires your understanding of the culture in which you're working in, whether it be a classroom or a home or in the community. But be creative with this because it matters. The way people look at individuals and the way they evaluate them or hold them in terms of their own perception is going to be linked to the way that you have designed your systems to support them. It's a critical point. It falls squarely in the category for me of an ethical responsibility to individuals because it is the way that we maintain their dignity. So that covers the final point too in terms of making it educational. I just want to point out, and I find this fascinating in Skinner's work in the notable book, Science and Human Behavior. One of the things that he talked about on a couple of occasions in the book, he used the term educational reinforcement. And the example that I just gave you is a prime example of educational reinforcement. Why? Because it's reinforcing. We're delivering a conditioned reinforcer, but at the same time, we've integrated an educational component right into to our system. So the implication for you as a registered behavior technician, stay creative. Be creative. Think of systems that you can use for the purpose of reinforcing individuals, and design programs based on that. Okay, let's begin with our definitions. Notice the bullseye there on the right-hand side. This is a definition that you'll want to remember, and the definition is of differential reinforcement. So all differential reinforcement procedures consist of two components. First, you're providing reinforcement upon either the occurrence of a behavior, this would be a desired behavior, right, that you're looking for. So reinforcement is delivered upon the occurrence of a desired behavior, or based on some schedule of the occurrence of the desired behavior. And that desired behavior has to be other than, different from the problem behavior. So you are reinforcing exactly those things that you want the person to do, and you're not reinforcing those behaviors that you don't want the person to engage in. And that leads us to the second component of this system, withholding reinforcement following the occurrence of the problem behavior. So the differential reinforcement procedures, everyone that I'm going to be describing here, consists of those two components. You're reinforcing the appropriate, you're withholding reinforcement for the inappropriate, and differential reinforcement procedures, just by way of linkage to some of the previous training that you've had, qualify as evidence-based practices. So once again, I'm going to remind you, we have an ethical responsibility to be using evidence-based practices in our own work. So differential reinforcement can be a useful tool to shape and refine forms of behavior by reinforcing differently one response over another. What does that mean? Well, when I see the desired behavior, that's going to be reinforced, and the undesired behavior is going to be treated differently. That's what differential reinforcement means. You are reinforcing and you are treating behaviors differently. So we also refer to these as the DR procedures, because there's many differential reinforcement procedures. I'm going to go through them one by one. Okay, with respect to each of the systems that I'm going to introduce, I'm going to give you a description of the system, and then I'm immediately going to link it to a case study, because I want to make sure that you're anchored every step of the way here. So what do we reinforce differently? Well, one consideration, one possibility is that we reinforce behavior other than the target behavior. So it could be anything other than the target behavior. So you're not even specifying what that needs to be. You're just saying that so long as you do not engage in the problem behavior, let's say it's tantrums, if you do anything other than that, you're eligible for reinforcement. The DRO procedure is also referred to as not only differential reinforcement of other behavior, but differential reinforcement of the omission of a particular behavior. So long as you don't tantrum, you'll be reinforced. So long as you don't wander or leave this home without our permission, you'll be reinforced. So long as you don't engage in property destruction, then you'll be reinforced. So the procedure emphasizes what not to do. So in the DRO procedure, differential reinforcement of other behavior, you're telling the person what they should not do. You're not necessarily telling them what they should do. You're just saying, so long as you don't do this, then you're eligible for reinforcement. Okay, with respect to the formal definition, differential reinforcement of other behavior is a procedure that provides reinforcement for the absence or omission of a problem within specified periods of time. So the DRO is an interval-based system. It's time-based. So you're telling the individual, you've got a DRO system, so long as you don't tantrum for 15 minutes, you're eligible for reinforcement. So long as you don't engage in property destruction for 15 minutes, you're eligible for reinforcement. So once again, you're telling the person what not to do during that 15-minute period. You're not telling them what they should do. You're just saying that so long as you omit and refrain from the problem, you'll be eligible for reinforcement. Now, one of the things that I want to get really clear at this stage is that you do not make up the time. For the DRO interval, it has to be a database decision. You just do not randomly or without important information just appoint a time interval in terms of the DRO. The way that you calculate what you should be doing for the DRO interval is based on your baseline data. So let's say I've got a person at baseline that is engaging in tantrum behavior twice per hour. So approximately one time every 30 minutes. However, I'll be able to see exactly what that person's inter-response time is. Remember that measure? What is the distance between the end of one response, a tantrum, and the beginning of another? So if I find, and I'm going to stay with the 30 minutes, if I find that the distance generally for a person between the end of one tantrum and the beginning of another, which is 30 minutes, then my DRO interval has to, of course, be shorter than 30 minutes. Maybe it's 20 minutes. My DRO is for 20 minutes. Why would I want to do that? Because I want to set the person up for success. If I'm finding that the IRT, the inter-response time, is 30 minutes, generally, then I'm not going to start my DRO at 30 minutes because the likelihood of that person achieving that is not good. But if I set it up at 20 minutes, then that will increase the likelihood and the probability that the person will achieve that objective. So the major point here is that when you're designing a DRO, differential reinforcement of other behavior, there's got to be a data analysis. There's got to be a database decision. And the way to do that is to consider the target behaviors that have been identified for the DRO, look at how often those target behaviors are occurring during baseline, and make sure that the interval that you establish is one that will likely result in a high probability of success for the individual. And this has to be done person by person, individual by individual. That determination in terms of the DRO interval needs to be individualized. That is something that you can expect your BCBA supervisor to be doing. Okay, so just to recap here. So differential reinforcement of other behavior is the specific reinforcement behavior for behavior other than the problem behavior, or for the omission of the problem behavior. It's a time-based system. It's an interval-based system. So we're reinforcing things other than the problem, telling the person what not to do, but not telling them what to do, and it's a time-based system. So remember those two things. Okay, let's go right into a case study to make this interesting for you. So, fictitious name, as I always do. I'm just going to call the girl Gracie. 9-year-old girl with a hemispherectomy. A hemispherectomy is a surgical procedure that's done for individuals that have uncontrolled seizures. So essentially, one of the hemispheres of their brain is either partially removed or completely removed. So imagine that, your entire left hemisphere of your brain missing, which is the language center of your brain, or the entire right hemisphere of your brain missing. So Gracie had a hemispherectomy when she was 7 years old, and she did have an entire hemisphere removed from her brain, the right hemisphere. Gracie's presenting problem was that she wandered from her home and put herself at high risk. The scenario specifically involved this. Gracie had been found by neighbors walking in the breakdown lane of a high traffic street. Her family lived on a well-traveled road that was kind of a pathway between two major thoroughways, and it was a pretty busy street. And the neighbors had found her on several occasions walking down in the breakdown lane. Why was that happening? Is because Gracie had a behavior of wandering. This also connects us to a crisis plan, and I'm going to in a safety net plan. I'm going to describe that in a minute. Okay, so our strategy. This is a behavior that obviously has to be taken extremely seriously. This is a behavior that cannot occur. So when you're doing consultation with a family, for example, you have to have systems in place that are highly reliable because a person's well-being is at risk as a result of that. So what I selected as an intervention is a smart band that Gracie wore. It's called a K-band, and it's a smart band that allows for the monitoring of an individual. This is a band that goes around the wrist, cannot be removed by the child. It was something that was aesthetically pleasing to Gracie. She actually liked the band. We had her engaged in preference assessment in terms of the color to pick out. She selected the pink. There were more than two options, by the way. There was a gray, there was a black, there was a pink, there was a blue. So there was a number of possibilities, and we just went through the preference assessment process with her to find out which one that she wanted. So the smart band works like this. It was applied to Gracie's arm, and you can set the distance between the band and what's referred to as a home unit, which is on the mom's, the dad's pocket, or on the belt, however they prefer to wear it. So if Gracie moved beyond a certain parameter, then that band would alert Gracie, and the band would also, well, not the band, but the home unit would alert the parents. And the parameters were adjustable. You can work it so that the child, for example, can't move beyond 4 feet of you, or 3 feet, or they cannot move beyond 15 feet. So it's constantly adjustable, and was adjusted with Gracie and her family based on where they were. So if they were at home, then the distance that Gracie was able to move was much greater than if they were in the mall. If they were in the mall, then the band was adjusted to a 3 feet parameter. But if they were at home, Gracie had much more flexibility and distance in which she could move. But if she went beyond the parameter, so if at home, if she went beyond 30 feet, for example, then that band would alert her, and the home unit would alert the mom and dad. And if they were in the mall and the band was adjusted and she went beyond a few feet, then the band would alert her, and the band would also alert mom and dad. Okay, so this is what we did for a DRO procedure. We told Gracie, we communicated with her through a picture-based system, that during an interval of time, it was a half an hour for her, during a 30-minute period, if she did not wander or activate the band, if it did not sound, if she did not get that sound from the band, and the mom and dad did not get that sound from the unit, if she refrained from doing that for 30 minutes, then she'd be eligible for reinforcement. What reinforcement? Well, it's all based on her preferences and her interests. And she really liked watching specific videos, for example. So that was one of the reinforcers that we used. She really was responsive to various forms of gustatory reinforcement. So we used gustatory reinforcement. But most importantly, the reason Gracie wandered is because she was trying to access tangibles in the community. And there were places that she liked to go, like the playground. So one of the reinforcers that we scheduled as well was frequent trips to that playground. So we gave her a reason for being cooperative, because she ultimately got access to what she wanted. So that was part of the reinforcement package as well. So we had multiple reinforcers in place. So once again, differential reinforcement of other behavior. Interval system. What interval for Gracie? 30 minutes. Why did we select 30 minutes? Because we determined that on average, she would be able to successfully pass that length of time because the behavior was occurring at an interval that was greater than 30 minutes. So she was wandering, for example, at baseline every 45 minutes, or trying to exit the house every 45 minutes. So we set it for 30 minutes. What was her requirement? You can do anything other than wander. Do anything other than activating that band during that 30-minute interval, and you're eligible for reinforcement. So once again, we're not going to tell you what to do. We're just telling you what not to do. Do not wander, as defined by exceeding the parameter adjustment of the band, and you'll be alerted as to whether you did that or not as a result of the sound being emitted from the band. So a 30-minute DRO, differential reinforcement of other behavior, telling the person what not to do. She can do anything but that. The 30 minutes was determined based on baseline data. The reinforcers that we delivered were based on the function of her behavior and trying to access tangibles, for example. So this is a system that we put in place. And from a data collection standpoint, we calculated the percentage of DRO contracts that were passed. And it was a percentage count, and we also counted the frequency of wandering behavior for her as well. Now, just by way of information, wandering among individuals with autism, children with autism are more likely to wander than any other individual and wander away from a safe environment. Many of these children have gone missing for significant periods of time. For individuals between the ages of 4 and 7 that are on the spectrum, about 11%. I'm sorry, for typically developing children, only about 11% will wander. For children on the spectrum, here we go right here, autism spectrum disorder, 46% of those individuals wander, those between 4 and 7 years old. If you move up to the ages between 8 and 11, and you look at typically developing children, only 1% of them wander. So they're more sophisticated, right? They're more advanced in terms of their knowledge of rules. But if you look at a child with autism spectrum disorder, 21% of those kids are wandering. Now here's the implication, and it also applied to Gracie. Of those kids that wander, 65% of them have close calls with traffic and injuries as a result of traffic. And then 27% of those individuals have close calls with drowning. And you've seen in the media, especially in the state of New York recently, for example, they just passed what's referred to as Avanti's Law, which gives a GPS to every family that has a child with autism spectrum disorder. Why? Because a young man left the high school, wandered out, and did drown. And this is something that is tragic and just horrific for families. And this is something that is of great concern. So this is a safety net plan. So I'm showing you this because this was part of Gracie's plan as well. We had prevention strategies in place. We had that band that she was using, but we also had fencing systems in place and alarms on the door. We had good coordination in terms of who was supposed to be supervising her at any given time, from the family. Fortunately, there was an extended family that lived together, and there was plenty of opportunity for people to take turns in terms of who would supervise. The home was secured, as I mentioned, with the alarm system. There was very clear communication among the family members in terms of who was responsible for what. We also had a GPS system for Gracie, and we also used that band that tracked her whereabouts. And this was not the case with Gracie, but it is the case with other individuals with autism spectrum disorder. Many times service dogs are used to prevent wandering. These are specially trained dogs that can be used for the purpose of preventing horrific behavior. And if they do wander, we had a plan in place, calling 911, gathering the search team, and then activating the search team, all of which have been pre-prepared in terms of a plan. And we had an emergency form already set up in terms of Gracie's picture, her weight, eye color, all identifying information. And Mom had actually dropped off that information to the local police stations as well, because she didn't want to wait for an emergency to occur before sharing that information with local law enforcement. Why did she do that? Well, because Gracie had a history of wandering. This information, this infographic, by the way, comes from Friendship Circle. And the website is friendshipcircle.com. It's a nonprofit organization that provides programs to support individuals with special needs. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention because there's a great infographic right here that we actually used as part of Gracie's plan. So there we have it. Differential reinforcement of other behavior. What is it? We're reinforcing behavior other than the target. We're not telling Gracie what to do. We're simply telling her what not to do. The next strategy is what's referred to as differential reinforcement of alternative behavior. So now we're providing a level of specificity to an individual. We are telling them what to do. We're naming what the alternative is. This is a procedure that involves reinforcing a very specific alternative to the problem behavior. So the DRA procedure involves the registered behavior technician reinforcing a response that's an alternative to the problem, but not necessarily incompatible with the problem. We'll talk about that one in a moment. So reinforcement is delivered on some predetermined schedule. Could be a fixed ratio, for example, or a variable ratio schedule. whereby the behavior is being reinforced after every X number of occurrences or after a varied number of occurrences. That's what fixed ratio means versus variable ratio. Okay, here's a case study. Once again, real story, authentic situation, and factual information. Here's the background. Cleo, 16-year-old girl with a trauma history. She had a history of physical abuse. The scenario is that Cleo had an extensive history of fire setting and fire setting behavior, which included setting fire to personal possessions. She would stockpile dolls, for example, and set them ablaze, and burning down an apartment building where her family lived. So her family had to move as a result of Cleo burning down the apartment building in which they lived. They had to leave the community. But for Cleo, there were a lot of disconcerting discussions about fire setting that occurred daily in her school. So as you can imagine, being in a high school and having open conversations about fire setting when the other students in that classroom knew that she had a history of fire setting. So Cleo, from an intellectual standpoint, was typically developing. Her impairments or cognitive challenges were no different from anybody else. She was functioning at grade level. Her language skills were developmentally appropriate, and she was actually quite bright. So we verified by way of a scatter plot, when this concerning conversation occurred, and it was during homeroom, first period of the day. That's when we would see the conversations occurring with other students about fire setting, and this was happening pretty much on a daily basis. So Cleo, in terms of strength-based approach, remember this piece, she was also a very gifted artist. But her family was unable to purchase her materials. They just didn't have the resources and the means to be purchasing her materials to do her artwork. And then we got that information as a result of a strength-based assessment. And then the information from the FBA suggested that her verbal behavior, her provocative talk about fire setting, for example, appeared to be motivated by attention. Attention from who? Attention from peers. Okay, so there we go. We did the scatter plot, the problems occurring during the day, homeroom, first period. She's talking provocatively. She's talking about fire setting. It's alarming everyone. So we want behavior alternative to that. We want to increase and reinforce alternatives to that. And then we find through the FBA that she's attention motivated. Okay, so here's our strategy. We developed differential reinforcement of alternative behavior, and a plan for doing that. We used a very specific procedure in the field of behavior analysis referred to as correspondence training. It's also referred to as say, do, report training. So we provided Cleo with art supplies, and in the first period in homeroom, we purchased them. We had them available. There were things that she liked, blank palettes, brushes, paints, oil paints. Then we also identified a subgroup of other students in that room that were also artists, and they were willing to spend time with Cleo, all voluntarily, something that they agreed to do, which was a good thing for us. So what we told Cleo was that we wanted her to come in and to say what she was going to do. This is a correspondence training. And she would say if she was going to do her artwork, go off and do it, and then report back that she had successfully done that. Now, here's the DRA component. In the context of the homeroom, while she was doing artwork with her peers and talking about art or talking about art materials or talking about anything alternative to fire setting or anything even having to do with fires, that alternative verbal behavior was reinforced by the teacher. So we set the stage. We tapped into her interest. She was given art supplies, and the teacher specifically reinforced conversation that was alternative to talk about fire setting. So it was a verbal behavior that was being targeted for change. From a data collection standpoint, we recorded the frequency of verbal references to arson, verbal references to fire setting, verbal references to fire in general. It's kind of a response class that was occurring, and we captured that response class. And the system, the DRA system, was designed so that she was reinforced by the teacher for alternative conversations. And the reinforcer for Clio was additional time to be spent on artwork at the end of the day. So she was banking these points essentially for doing more artwork at the end of the day. So that was the actual reinforcer that we used. So how does it work? Once again, differential reinforcement of alternative behavior. What does that mean, alternative? Well, alternative to your target behavior. What was the target behavior? Talk about fire setting, talk about arson, talk about things having to do with igniting materials and using matchers and lighters and things along that line. What was the alternative? Well, verbal conversation and discussions about artwork, verbal conversation and discussions about social activities, for example. Those were the things. And we told Clio that these are your alternatives. These are the things that we want you to talk about. When we find that you're talking about those things and doing that as an alternative to talk about fire setting, then we will acknowledge what you're doing, reinforce you with additional points that you can accumulate and use for even doing more artwork, which you love to do. That is the DRA procedure. Now, this is different from a time-based procedure because there's no time involved here. Rather, the behavior occurs, the discussion about art, the discussion about social activity, the behavior occurs, it's reinforced on some schedule. So it occurs, reinforced. It occurs, reinforced. So it's not based on time like the DRO. It's based on the response. It's based on the actual occurrence of the desired and alternative behavior. And that's how a DRA system differs from a DRO. DRO is time-based, differential reinforcement of other behavior. Time-based. DRA is based on the actual responses and the occurrences of the alternative behavior. And that's Clio's story. And she did quite well. We essentially eradicated talk about fires, and she successfully completed the school year, actually, and she had no attempts at arson during the school year in which we worked with her. I've lost track with her, so I'm not quite sure how her life evolved, hopefully well, for her benefit and for the family's benefit. But that's a DRA procedure. Now, the next procedure I want to discuss is what's referred to as differential reinforcement of incompatible behavior. So what do we reinforce differently? Well, behavior that is physically incompatible with the target behavior. So behavior that's incompatible, when we're reinforcing that, it's referred to as DRI. That's the acronym. And the DRI procedure involves the registered behavior technician, this is you, reinforcing responses that are physically incompatible with the target response. Specifically, it's impossible for the two behaviors to occur together. They can't occur at the same time, such as imitating someone's person and pressing your elbows against your torso. And I'm going to give you the reason why I use that as an example in a moment. So reinforcement's delivered based on some predetermined schedule. So after each occurrence of the target that you see, the incompatible behavior, you can reinforce. So you can do that on a fixed ratio schedule. So for example, if you notice and observe that the person is engaged in something physically incompatible with the target, you can reinforce them every time you see it. That's what's referred to as a fixed ratio 1 schedule. If you reinforce a person after every third time you see it, which is a possibility, we'd refer to that as a fixed ratio 3 schedule, every third time. Okay, let's get you anchored. Let's get the case study here again. This involved a 25-year-old man, fictitious name Piers, and he was a man with Tourette syndrome. And based on a self-report, Piers indicated that he had motor tics that were very embarrassing to him and extremely disruptive. And these motor tics occurred very often in the context of a social situation. So with respect to the actual scenario, Piers has what's referred to as a complex motor tic, and specifically it's called echo phenomena. So what Piers does is that he repeats the mannerisms of a person that he observes. So for example, if you're talking to Piers and you happen to gesture to somebody in the room, you point to them, then he'll mirror your action. And that's part of his Tourette syndrome. He'll gesture in an identical way. And if you reached up to your face and you adjusted your eyeglasses, for example, let's say you push the bridge of the nose up closer to your forehead, he'd repeat that gesture, even though he didn't wear eyeglasses. So as you can see, it can be pretty embarrassing, because if you're sitting across from Piers or standing across from him and you point and he points, or you adjust your eyeglasses, which you wear, and he goes through the same mannerisms, then you can see how it can be socially very awkward. And that's a form of Tourette syndrome, and it's called echo phenomena. And people that engage in those tics, they're referred to as complex motor tics. Okay, so the strategy that we use for Piers is what's referred to as a competing response training strategy. This is a strategy that involves teaching a client, such as Piers, to engage in voluntary behaviors that are physically incompatible with the impending tic. So competing response training is part of what's referred to as a comprehensive behavioral intervention for tics. The acronym is CBIT, Comprehensive Behavioral Intervention for Tics. And this treatment package was developed by a team of researchers from Mass General Hospital in Boston, and Harvard Medical School, Yale University, and the University of Texas Health Science Center at San Antonio. So it was a collaborative program, and it was a collaborative exercise in terms of developing a comprehensive treatment program for individuals with Tourette syndrome. So specifically, Piers was taught to press his elbows into his torso, which was something that he decided he wanted to do, not us. It was his decision. That's the topography of behavior that he wanted. And the reason for that is because it was something that he did, he was familiar with, and it was something already in his repertoire. So whenever the antecedents presented themselves, what antecedent? Remember I told you in a previous module that people can be an antecedent, or a social situation can be an antecedent. That was the antecedent for him. If he was in a social situation, have a conversation, that's when the tic was going to occur. So what Piers decided to do was to press his elbows into his torso whenever the antecedent presented itself for the echo tic. And he learned this through a phase of the program called awareness training. We also had in place for Piers, baseline level of data collection. We used a self-monitoring, self-recording component that was also part of the program. And specifically, we used a device called Tallymander, which is available as an app online. You can easily download it yourself. So our differential reinforcement procedure was for behaviors that were physically incompatible with the target. What target? Imitating the motor movements of other people. What was physically incompatible? Pressing his elbows into his torso and keeping his hands down. Why is it incompatible? Well, you can't be pressing your elbows into your torso and keeping your hands down and imitating somebody at the same time. It's just physically impossible. You can't be doing the same thing. You can't be doing the two behaviors at the same time. So that's why it's referred to as differential reinforcement of incompatible behavior. This differs from differential reinforcement of alternative behavior, because alternatives, like with Clio, were not necessarily incompatible. But in the case of Piers, the behavior that he engaged in and was reinforced for was physically incompatible with the target behavior. And that's what's referred to as a DRI. So far we've got differential reinforcement of other behavior, time-based, differential reinforcement of alternative behavior, behaviors alternative to the target, that the reinforcement is based on the responses, and the responses being identified and and reinforcing consequences being delivered as a result of the occurrence. Differential reinforcement of incompatible behavior. Okay, now we're telling the person that not only do you need to engage in a particular behavior, but what you do has to be physically incompatible with the problem. Like what? Like pressing your elbows into to your torso rather than imitating a person's movement. You, in your work as a registered behavior technician, will come into contact with individuals with a variety of different clinical presentations. And one of the things that will be important for you to do is to ensure that you have an understanding of these various syndromes. So Tourette syndrome, for example, is a neurological disorder that's characterized by repetitive and stereotyped and involuntary movements and vocalizations, which are called tics. It'll be important for you that if you're going to be working with an individual with a particular clinical presentation, it'd be important for you to do research in terms of what that presentation is about. So the person may have autism spectrum disorder, or they may have some kind of anxiety disorder like obsessive compulsive disorder or trichotillomania. They may have Tourette syndrome. They may have Williams syndrome. They may have Down syndrome. So for you as a registered behavior technician, ensuring that you have good familiarity with these various clinical presentations and syndromes will be well worth your while. So there's plenty of information that's available regarding the causes of specific disorders, the diagnosis, how the behaviors are brought under control, and that kind of information is readily available to you through some good research. Take the guidance of your BCBA supervisor to ensure that you get credible research and credible descriptions in your hands, and just don't rely on just internet searches for doing that. So that's our DRI procedure. So we got, of the DR procedures, the differential reinforcement procedures, DRO, DRA, DRI. We're building your knowledge base. The next procedure is what's referred to as differential reinforcement of low rate behavior. And this involves reinforcing just lower rates of a problem. So it doesn't have to be eradicated, it doesn't have to be eliminated. You're just reinforcing lower rates of the problem. For the DRL procedure, there's what's referred to as a full session DRL, an interval DRL, or a space responding DRL. A full session DRL involves delivering reinforcement and responding is equal to or below a criterion level for an entire session. The interval DRL involves dividing the full session to a series of equal parts, and then just delivering reinforcement if responding is equal to or below a criterion level for the interval. And then finally, spaced responding means that you're arranging the reinforcement when responses are separated by a certain period of time. Okay, so let's get you anchored here once again. And here's the value of case studies. This case study has nothing to do with individuals with disabilities. To anchor you, this is research that was done by one of my students at California State University in Northridge. Here's the background. There's a social phenomenon referred to as phubbing, and that means to ignore a person or a person's in one's surroundings or in a social situation by busying yourself with your own cell phone. So you're looking at text messages, you're looking at email, you're looking at various forms of communication. You're on Facebook, or you're on Twitter, for example, or you're using social media in the presence of other people. Do these facial expressions look familiar to you right here? Sure they do, because you know people that engage in phubbing behavior pretty consistently, or maybe you're one of those individuals that are guilty yourself of not attending to the people that are around you or the individual across from you, but busying yourself with your own cell phone. So here's a scenario. One of my undergraduate students did an experiment at California State University, Northridge, and the experiment involved a female undergraduate student measuring the inter-response time of her boyfriend's phubbing behavior in a restaurant. So she just specifically picked a restaurant setting for convenience. And she found it both embarrassing and distressing when her boyfriend did this. he would frequently during the course of dinner pick up his phone and put it down. So there was a discrete behavior, fortunately. He wasn't somebody that kept it in his hand all the time. He would pick it up, look at it, respond to text, put it down. So the behavior was discrete, so it lent itself to measuring from an inter-response time standpoint. What's inter-response time? Well, that time between the end of one response and the beginning of another one. That time is the locus. Do you remember that term as well from previous training? So she did a baseline, and she looked at his inter-response time in terms of his phubbing behavior while in a restaurant. Okay, what do we know about this this boyfriend? Well, he loved talking about traveling. He liked talking about traveling to foreign countries and exotic countries such as Thailand. So the strategy that was developed by this undergraduate student is that she collected IRT data into response time, and then she set up a spaced responding DRL intervention. Okay, what does that mean? All right, so he was picking up his cell phone. On average, the IRT was just about 3 minutes. So she wanted to set him up for success, and she wanted to deliver a reinforcer for lower rates of behavior. So if he was picking up the cell phone one time every 3 minutes, then within a 6 minute period, for example, if he only picked up his phone once, which would be a lower rate, then she would differentially reinforce him by way of talking about travel and travel to a foreign country. And keep in mind, this is just an experiment done by an undergraduate student. She's just exploring this whole notion of differential reinforcement of low rate behavior, and that's what she had selected. So lower rates, well, if you pick up your phone only once within 6 minutes, that's better than you picking it up twice within 6 minutes, which was what was occurring at baseline. So therefore, she reinforced lower rates of behavior. Because one of the things that you need to know about a DRL is that many times we use this system when a certain level of the behavior is appropriate, is okay, but not higher levels of the behavior. So we specifically reinforce an individual for lower rates of the target. What was the target? The phubbing behavior. Why did we want lower rates? Is because it was distressing and embarrassing to the individual, and she was trying to get it under better control. So DRL is differential reinforcement of low rate behavior. You will have to work with your BCBA supervisor if you use this system to make a determination as to whether you'll use a full session DRL, an interval DRL, or a spaced responding DRL, because there's a number of variations with respect to the DRL procedure. The next differential reinforcement procedure is what's referred to as differential reinforcement of high rate behavior. So this is the companion to the DRL. So now we want higher rates to occur. So DRH, differential reinforcement of high rates, occurs when the delivery of reinforcement is contingent on responses occurring at a higher rate than a predetermined level. So essentially what we want is shorter and shorter inter-response times. Okay, let's anchor you here again. I'm going to use myself as an example. Background, I was 15 years old, ambitious little kid, and I worked at a factory, and it was called Hasbro Toy Factory, and it was located in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, where I grew up. And I worked on the assembly line in that context. Here's a scenario. When high production was necessary, the foreman of the factory would jump up on the conveyor belt, the assembly belt, and would tell us that if we could increase our production within a half an hour, we'd be able to finish our shift early. So I was working a 3 to 11 shift, and the idea of leaving early was just fabulous because I was in high school at the time, and was very motivated to get out early and to go study and do my homework after the shift. So if we worked faster, if we produced at a higher rate, then we'd be eligible for reinforcement. So the foreman knew, how many items we assembled within a half an hour period or an hour period, and he specified just exactly what the production would be, the higher level, and what would qualify as reinforcement. So what was I assembling? I was actually assembling GI Joe dolls. I don't know if any of you recall GI Joes, but I used to love these things when I was a kid. So the assembly line was involving the actual assembly of those dolls. So the number of GI Joe dolls that were assembled, so long it was at a rate higher than what we typically did as a group on the assembly line, then we were eligible for reinforcement. What was a reinforcement? We left early. Powerful reinforcer for us. So very culturally appropriate. Was very linked to things that motivated us as a group. So that's the DRH schedule, differential reinforcement of high rate behavior. You are reinforcing behavior that occurs at a higher rate from baseline. So for those things that we want to see more of, we will use a DRH procedure. And those are your DR methods that you'll be using with your registered behavior technician. Expect to do a DRO, differential reinforcement of other behavior, reinforcing on a time-based schedule. Reinforcing what? Any behavior other than the target. DRA, differential reinforcement of alternative behavior. Reinforcing what? Behavior that's alternative to the target. DRI, differential reinforcement of incompatible. Reinforcing what? Behavior that is physically incompatible with the target. Can't occur at the same time. DRL, reinforcing what? Differential reinforcement of low rate behavior. Behavior that's occurring just at a lower rate because I just want less of it. DRH, differential reinforcement of high rate behavior. What am I reinforcing? Behavior that's occurring at a higher level because I want more of it. The time-based procedure in all of this is the DRO. The others are based on responses and whatever schedule of reinforcement you have set up to reinforce the responses. It could be a fixed ratio, a variable ratio schedule, for example, or a fixed interval or a variable interval schedule that's being used. Now, one slight modification I wanted to tell you about is what's referred to as the momentary DRO. That connects to your momentary time sampling. What that means is that at the end of a pre-specified interval, if you notice that there's an omission of the problem behavior, the person becomes eligible for reinforcement. So that's referred to as momentary DRO. Now, what goes hand in glove with the differential reinforcement procedures is an extinction procedure. So our emphasis is on strengthening stimulus response consequence relationships. We do that through the differential reinforcement. However, for this to work well, we also need to eliminate or withhold the reinforcement that's maintaining the behavior in the first place. So in order to reduce or eliminate behavior, we need to use one of the basic principles in behavior analysis is referred to as extinction. The specific definition of extinction is that it involves withholding and discontinuing reinforcement, the reinforcement that's responsible for maintaining a behavior. How do I know what's maintaining behavior? Okay, back to your FBA. The only way you're going to know what's maintaining behavior is through your functional behavior assessment or your functional analysis. So for that reason, the extinction procedure that you use has to be based on the FBA results or your functional analysis results. Because as you know, people engage in behavior for different reasons. So extinction requires your understanding of the function of behavior. If you say you're using an extinction procedure, you're making a bold statement. Because essentially what you're saying is that you know what's motivating the individual and why the behavior is functioning. Extinction, by the way, is different from punishment. Extinction decelerates behavior as a result of the operation of withholding reinforcers. So there's a decrease in behavior, that's the effect, and the operation is withholding reinforcement. Punishment, on the other hand, results in a decrease in behavior as well as a result of adding something or removing something from the individual. That's different. Punishment is different from extinction. Extinction is different in terms of the operation. The operation in extinction is withholding or discontinuing reinforcement. The operation and punishment is adding something, adding a stimulus, or removing a stimulus for the purpose of decreasing a behavior. So I want to make sure for you as a registered behavior technician, you never confuse extinction with punishment. They are two different basic principles. So once again, we have an ethical obligation to conduct functional behavior assessment or functional analysis in order to responsibly select, design, and classify our behavioral interventions. And extinction is a critical component of the differential reinforcement procedures, because while we're at that business of reinforcing other behavior, or reinforcing alternative behavior, or reinforcing incompatible behavior, or reinforcing low rates or high rate behavior, we also need to arrange for the withholding of reinforcers in the event the behavior occurs. So you remember Gracie? We need to make sure we're withholding the reinforcers as a result of her wandering. Remember Cleo? We need to make sure we're withholding the reinforcers as a result of her talk about fires. Do you remember Piers? We need to make sure we're withholding reinforcement in the event that there's an occurrence of the complex motor tic. So in order to do that, we need to understand what the reinforcers are for the individual. And Dr. Brian Iwata, who I've introduced to you before, has made a very important contribution to the field because he has identified for us different types of extinction procedures. So there can be extinction involving sensory consequences, whereby that is resulting in automatic reinforcement. So we have to use what's referred to as sensory extinction. So withholding reinforcement for the sensory, for the behavior that's occurring in order to produce sensory consequences. That is one form of extinction. Another form of extinction is what's referred to as escape extinction. Escape occurs as a result of and is maintained as a result of negative reinforcement. What does that mean? Well, we'll go back to your good definition that I gave you in one of the early modules. Negative reinforcement is a behavior that increases as a result of removing something aversive or uncomfortable. So people escape because they're removing something uncomfortable or aversive, and that's what maintains high rate of a particular behavior. So in the escape extinction process, we have to make sure that the person doesn't come in contact with that desired consequence. That's different from sensory extinction. Escape extinction is another category. Next, we have what's referred to as attention extinction. So in this form of behavior that's occurring, it's controlled by positive reinforcement. Person engages in something. So let's go back to Cleo. She engages in fire talk. Why? Because she's looking for attention. What kind of attention? Positive reinforcement. Why is it positive? Because people are adding attention to her, adding that stimulus and increasing her behavior. So there's what's referred to as attention extinction. And then the final form of extinction is tangible extinction. So withholding the tangibles the person is trying to get. So the extinction process and the extinction procedure is designed to ensure that we are differentially reinforcing what we want, but at the same time, within the same program, withholding reinforcement for the behaviors that we don't want. So they go hand in glove, and that's why I'm introducing the two of them here for you. Sensory extinction, escape extinction, attention extinction, and tangible extinction. Now, just to touch on the crisis plan and safety net plans, which are also part of a behavior intervention plan, we have these in place for things like wandering behavior. If you are working with a BCBA supervisor and you have a serious problem such as wandering, you need to have a crisis plan in place. Or if you have serious behavior involving aggression, you need to have a crisis plan in place. Or self-injurious behavior, or allergies, or bipolar disorder, or suicide threats, or seizures. There's got to be a safety procedure, a crisis plan in place. And that crisis plan may involve you doing some pre-planning with the team, One of the things I mentioned to you about Gracie's mom is that she went to the police stations. She handed out descriptions of her daughter, photographs, and critical information about her. That was all done at a pre-planning level. You will have incident reporting responsibilities if you work in a school or for a private agency, for example. So speak with your BCBA supervisor about incident report responsibilities and what that looks like. You have a critical responsibility for communication. Take the instance of wandering, for example. If you're responsible for providing one-to-one supervision to an individual, let's say you're at a school and you're at a bus stop and you need to leave that child's side for a brief period of time, that information has to be communicated clearly. You also have an obligation, as far as I'm concerned, to do some rehearsals in terms of emergency. It's like fire drills that you're doing in the event of that an emergency occurs. Now, one of the best ways of ensuring that a safety plan is in place and people know exactly what to do under circumstances is through what's referred to as infographics. So bullying can present a crisis. This can be something that we have to have a safety net plan in place. It could be physical forms of bullying, verbal forms of bullying, social forms of bullying, or cyberbullying. So there's got to be a plan in place in terms of how that will be managed. So some action steps in terms of bullying can be mapped out. This one was done by Children's Hospital in Colorado. Or for a person, for example, that has a history of seizures, you must be trained and you need to know exactly what to do in the event of an individual having a tonic-clonic seizure, for example, a full-body seizure. What is it that you do? So infographics can be integrated into this emergency plan, and this was done by the Epilepsy Foundation and available through them. So in summary, I've introduced you to the differential reinforcement procedures, the DRO, the DRA, the DRI, the DRL, the DRH. All are different. Which one is interval based? It's a DRO. That's different from the others that are response based. So all these things are going into your behavior intervention plan. All these things become a component of the plan, and all these things rely on you and your BCBA supervisor having identified effective reinforcers through a preference assessment. Then your behavior intervention plan also needs to have a crisis plan or a safety plan in the event that you have an individual that's putting themselves or others at risk. So the questions list the different types of reinforcement procedures: DRO, momentary DRO, differential reinforcement of alternative behavior DRA, DRI, DRL, DRH. Which procedures are time-based? Well, the DRO and the MDRO. Which differential reinforcement procedures requires you to reinforce behavior that's physically incompatible with the target? That's DRI, differential reinforcement of incompatible behavior. What are the 4 variations of extinction and why they're important? Well, there's sensory extinction, escape extinction, attention extinction, tangible extinction. The procedure that you put in place must be based on the function of behavior. That's why it's important. Why are crisis and safety net plans so important? Crisis and safety net plans can be prepared proactively and give you and the stakeholders a procedure to follow in the event of a crisis. That concludes modules 19, 20, and 21. We covered a lot of information here, a real lot. And these differential reinforcement procedures are evidence-based practices, very effective, but you need to be making database decisions about how they're constructed, especially as it relates to the planned delivery of reinforcement and the rules around the delivery of reinforcement. They have very specific meanings, and I want to make sure that you have a clear understanding of each of them because you will use them as a registered behavior technician. Thanks again for your attention, and I'll talk to you in the next module.